Hello and welcome back. Well, I've been working in the new shed for quite a while now and everything is absolutely great. But there's one thing that's been missing, and that is a vise. Currently, if I need to use a vise, I have to take whatever it is I'm working on back up into the garage and use the vise in there. I asked the people down at the Woodturners Guild if anyone had an old vise, and one of the guys brought over this vise here, which he no longer needed. Now, this is a Hercules vise. I believe it's Canadian, but I'm sure if that's not right, someone's going to correct me in the comments. And it's about 265 wide for the jaws, and they open out to around about 280 millimeters deep. I have the vise here sitting on my miter station, the left-hand side of the miter station, and that's where I'm going to mount it. I have some supports under the table here on the left and on the right, and I need to mount the vise in the middle of those supports. Now, apart from being old and a bit dinged up, there's a few parts missing, like the lever that goes in here, which operates the quick release for the vise. So I'm going to have to make those parts and the bar that goes all the way down the other end. That said, the half nut is still with the vise, which is good because it's a lot easier making a lever and a link rather than a half nut. However, the half nut actually goes in through the bottom hole there, so it goes in upside down under the lead screw. So this has been put together not correctly. I believe the reason is because this wooden plate that goes on top engages the half nut all of the time. If it was at the bottom, then it wouldn't engage and the vise wouldn't work. You'll notice at the end here there's a piece of wood that was put there by the person who gave me the vise. He said he had to put it there because there was nothing there at all and the bars and the lead screw were all flopping around all over the place. Now that piece of wood does restrict opening the vise to the full potential, so I'm going to make a metal plate to replace this piece. This should be a good project. I'm going to have to make some parts to get it all functioning again. It needs a bit of a cleanup on the top of the vise here and on the back here as well. Someone's been bashing it with a hammer and chipping bits out, so that needs to be tidied up. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mount the vise onto the bench, and the reason why I want to do that now is so that I have all the fixture mounting all sorted out, so that when the vise has been restored and it's nice and shiny, hopefully, I won't be scratching it or dinging it while I try to mount it under the bench there. The first thing I need to do is disassemble the vise. I'm taking off this wooden piece at the back here. Just a split pin and then a couple of taps with the hammer, and that comes off pretty easy. I clean off those shafts, then the lead screw can be removed and the fixed jaw and the moving jaw can be separated. I was going to mount the vise over here in between the two white marks because I have space underneath, but I've got some space on this side and it's probably better down this end of the bench. So I need to cut away the wood here a bit so that the vise can fit in there. I mark that out with a white pen, and then we're on to the multi-tool. I thought this was going to be a bit of hard work, but it turned out pretty easy in the end. Just multi-tool it out and then use a chisel to remove the wood. Those slots are all done, and then the vise will just fit up in there like that. And that looks good. I have the vise clamped to the bench where I want to mount it, and I'm going to use these coach bolts to hold it in place. I start by drilling a pilot hole for the coach bolt, and once that's done I can screw in the coach bolts. I have the coach bolts fitted on both sides here, and now the next piece is to put a bit of wood at the top here, so more coach bolts can be put in the back holes. This is a piece of 6x2. I tidy up one of the ends and then I measure out how much I need to fit in that area, and then that's cut off there as well. Now I have to mark out for the leg of the table, so we need to chop that piece out. And what better machine to use than a bandsaw. I have it jammed up in there, and I'm drilling the holes for the coach screws and also one on the other side, and I tighten these all down. That piece of wood is not mounted in the frame yet, so then I drill some holes and then I screw that piece of wood into the table on both sides and in the front, and that allows the piece of wood to be exactly where the bottom of the vise wants to be. I slid the movable jaw back into the fixed jaw, and the operation here works very nicely. It does feel really secure and solid in there. I've brought everything into the garage or the machining shop, so it's all close to the tools that I need. And the first thing I need to do is just finish disassembling. And I'm taking off these bits of wood on the fixed jaw. And also I do the same on the moving jaw. So those pieces are taken off. Here's the half nut, and it was in there like that with a bit of wood on top. There's a little hole in the wood for that thing to go into, but I think we have an issue with this because it doesn't actually fit down in there. So I don't think this half nut is actually for this vise. You can see here that the pin that goes from the bottom of the half nut doesn't even line up the hole in the bottom of the vise. So this pin here should be probably more in the center here. So I don't think it's the right part. That said, we need to make this part fit in that hole somehow. I traced the outside of the pin, and there's quite a bit of meat to come out, and I think we're going to have to take a lot of the top of this part here off to get that to go through. I'm using a straight burr to cut this out, and I do stop frequently to see how the half nut fits and if it's coming through the hole. The other thing is that the half nut is wider than the slot, so it doesn't actually go down in the slot. And it's not by much, but I just have to take a little bit off the sides. I actually took more off the bottom here than the top here, so it's a little bit tapered, and the hole here, it's a bit butchered, but it's just what we had to do. But the half nut fits down there, it goes right down the bottom, which is good. The lead screw can go back in there, slides all the way through without touching the half nut. And if I lift it up, then I can actually turn the handle and the vise will close up. So the function of the half nut is actually working now in this vise. And once the half nuts drop down again, the lead screw can come in and out. The lead screw will be tied to the front jaw, so it'll sort of move in and out like that. I give these parallel bars a bit of a sanding down using some very fine sandpaper. So most of that's done off camera. However, there is some evidence of someone hammering here, so I need to get a file out and just smooth those down. I need to work on this part here, a little latch that goes into the half nut, and it's a bar that goes all the way down so it can be controlled from the front. However, I need to make the plate at the back before I do that because the lead screw is just floating around here. So that needs to be all secure before I work out where exactly the half nut needs to be. The diameter of these parallel bars is about 22.15 millimeters, and I don't have a reamer for that. I drilled a test hole in here, and this sort of almost goes on. However, it will need some honing out to make it fit. So the purpose of that is just so I know that my 22mm drill doesn't drill too big, and I'll be able to hone out the proper part that I make next. This may look a little complicated. I don't really have a good reference for the holes, although this bottom piece here, the distance from that hole to that hole there are the same, so I think that's pretty level. So I'm going to use that for a reference. And just to make it harder for me, they've made the center hole a little off center by 5.3 millimeters from the center of these outside holes. So I have to account for that. And although this is almost 26 millimeters, we only need a 1/2 inch hole in the bracket that we're making. The center for these two holes is 97.24 millimeters. I've transferred the important measurements over to the piece. This is a bit of 10mm thick steel, and I start by drilling that 1/2 inch hole, and that is 5.3 millimeters off the center. Then I set up for the outside holes. This is a 22mm drill bit for the right hand side, and I also drill out the left hand side. And that is all the drilling done for that part. As I said, the parallel bars are about 0.15 bigger, probably about 5-6 thou. So I use this little honing tool that I made to try and hone it out. And then I get to a point where the bar almost goes in, and I know that I can knock that on with a hammer. That is exactly what I do to test it on here. That is a nice tight fit. I have that plate fitted and I'm feeding through the lead screw, and that hole that I drilled down there was exactly in the right place. Hardly any play there. I'm very happy with that. This is a simple part, a little washer type thing for the end of the lead screw. And I need to drill this out to 1/2 inch to take the lead screw. So that fits on there. I'm using a split pin temporary. I'll probably put a roll pin in here. Now, although the plate at the back seems tight, I saw it move a little bit. So I've decided to drill some holes and to tap out some M6 threads here so I can put some grub screws through the plate and into those parallel bars. The grub screws are done on each side, and I have this spaced out, but this is going to change because I really need to put a washer in the front here. So that's what I'm going to work on next. Always keep those scraps and offcuts, and I found this, which is perfect size. I cleaned it up on the grinder because it had a bit of rust on the outside, but that's going to work really good for the washer that we need. I need to true it up in the chuck, and once that's done, then I can start drilling out the hole. The hole needs to be 22.15mm, so I use a drill, and then I take out about 0.15mm with a boring bar. The washer's there on the front, so that is all good, and I've sorted out the spacing at the back here as well. So now we can work on this half nut, and I think I need to chop this piece here off for the design that I'm going to do. Here is the plan, and when that half nut is down and engaged, then it is 17.5mm high. And then when the half nut is disengaged and the lead screw can move freely, it is about 25mm high. And this half nut is around 16mm diameter. So the plan is to build something around the half nut stem and to support it. So a little sleeve around here. And then it'll also have a spring in the center of it, pushing the half nut onto the lead screw. Got a couple of springs there. One might be too powerful, but we can test them out and see what they're like. The first thing I need to do is remove this piece of casting here, and that is easily done with the angle grinder. I smooth it all down off camera. I've drawn a little plan of what I need here. It's a bit of round stock with a hole down the middle, 16.2mm, and it's 50mm high. I found a piece of scrap that had the right outside diameter, so it's just a matter of drilling a hole out the middle, which I had to drill to 17mm because the half nut was a bit wider at the bottom here. So that's our part there, and the next thing we need to do is mount it to the bottom. So I've made up this little plate. I'll put a hole in the middle. This will be welded to the plate, and then there'll be a screw at each end so that it can be screwed onto the cast iron casting. Of course, it'll be mounted over the half nut stem in this position here. I really should have clamped this vise to the drill press while I drilled the hole out in the plate. The plate fits over the half nut stem, and then this will go on here. The spring goes in, and of course it'll be welded, and I need to make a cap that goes in here and thread this part. Now I actually had to make this part again because the hole in the original part was too big for the tap, and I probably could have got a thread in there, but it probably would have been a bit loose. So anyway, the next step is to put a thread in this new part, and I start that off in the lathe, and then I finish that off in the vise where I have more control over it. The threads are done, and that fits over there. Spring goes in, That is a top view, and I need to make the cap that screws onto there now. I cut quite a long piece of 25mm round bar. That's so I can get it in a collet later on. I turn that down to 16.5mm, and the smart ones watching will know that I've cocked this up. I use a bit of cutting oil, and then I bring in the die. This was cutting really easy, and there is a good reason for that, because it hardly cut any threads at all. I turned that piece down to 16.5mm when it should have been 18.5mm. So I spend the next while turning that piece down again. Lucky I cut this piece a little bit longer than I needed. Here we go, take two after turning it down to 18.5mm, and I can tell the threads are cutting. This is quite hard because it's an M18 thread. That screws on there nicely. I put a little chamfer on the end here as well, and I also cut a little relief in the back here. This is why I cut the original bar a little bit longer, because I wanted to get it into a collet so that I could mill some flats on here. I mill them down so I can get a 18mm spanner on there. And that is a beautiful fit. If you know me by now, I've cut this off with the angle grinder off camera, and I put it back in the lathe just to true it up. The spring goes in there, and the cap screws on, and once that's fully down, I can see there is some spring tension there. If I need more tension, I can always add a washer in here. The next step is to cut a piece out of here, and that is to give it clearance for the bar that goes through here and lifts the half nut. Now I have the half nut in the right place. I've wound the vise in a bit as if tightening it, and that pulls the half nut up against the inside wall of this face here. That is the natural position for the half nut for when you are tightening up the vise, and that's where we want to fix our supports around the stem of the half nut. I've marked some lines on this piece. That is where the groove in the half nut stem stops, and then I can transfer those lines onto this piece. The next step is to mill out the material, and I'm taking out around 8 to 8.5mm. I have this piece of scrap that I'm going to use as a test piece, so that slides in there, and then this piece here will be welded onto that plate, and then it should move up and down like that. Because I don't have the equipment or the skills to weld these pieces together, this plate is going to be bolted onto the cast iron. I'll drill out a couple of holes, and they're tapped out to M6. Now that the plate is bolted down, I test it again, and this works really well. In fact, the plate here takes place of the hole that would have been in the casting, had it been the correct part. I don't have a good way to clamp this, so I'm just measuring the same distance on each side, hold it there and tack it on. I have assembled the cap and the spring in there, and this works perfectly. The spring is pulling it back down, and I can twist the bar to lift it up. Well, that mechanism came out really good. Works well. In fact, if I bolted the vise to the bench now, it would operate because there's spring tension in here, which holds the half nut in. However, we'd have no quick release because there's no bar that's running down the side here to lift it out the way. Now, I do have quite a few other bits and pieces to do on this vise, and this video is probably going to go into 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to do those other tasks in the next video. So they're going to include putting a piece of steel in here so that the mechanism can be quick released. There's a piece in the front here that needs to be made up, and a little handle in here so it can be moved to do the quick release. There's also the top of the jaws that need to be machined down, and I need to tidy up this handle. The centerpiece here probably needs to be machined. And what the hell is that? Looks like someone decided to bash a nail in there or something. So that needs to be addressed. In addition, there is a plate that needs to go across here, be bolted and probably fixed to the mechanism that I just made. Also need to work out what to do with these bits of wood, whether I can reuse them or do I need to find some other bits of hardwood to replace them. And of course, the whole vise needs to be painted. So still quite a bit of work to do. Probably another 15-20 minute video. So we'll leave all that to the next video. I hope everyone has a great day. And once again, thanks for watching.